Queen Victoria, the monarch who defined an empire, Part 1. An unexpected heir. On the morning of May 24, 1819, in the modest surroundings of Kensington Palace, a baby girl was born who would one day rule the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Yet at the moment of her birth, no one could have predicted such a destiny. The infant was christened Alexandrina Victoria, daughter of Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a minor German princess who had been widowed and left with 2 children before marrying the Duke. The circumstances that would eventually place this child on the British throne were a combination of tragedy and demographic accident. King George III, who had suffered from recurring bouts of mental illness, had 15 children, but by 1817 the succession appeared alarmingly fragile. The king's eldest son, the Prince Regent who would become George IV, had only one legitimate child, Princess Charlotte, and she was widely beloved as the future queen. But in November 1817, Charlotte died in childbirth along with her infant son, plunging the nation into profound mourning and creating a constitutional crisis. The aging sons of George III suddenly found themselves in a race to produce a legitimate heir. Edward, Duke of Kent, abandoned his longtime companion to marry Princess Victoria in what was frankly a dynastic arrangement designed to secure the succession. The Duke was 51 years old, heavily in debt, and had spent most of his life in military postings abroad. He was determined that his child should be born on English soil to strengthen any claim to the throne. The Duchess was already pregnant when the couple made an arduous journey from Germany to England, traveling in a second-hand carriage because they could not afford a new one. They settled into apartments at Kensington Palace, which even then was considered shabby and unfashionable compared to the grand royal residences. When Victoria was born, she stood 5th in line to the throne, behind her 3 surviving uncles and the infant son of the Duke of Clarence. Her father, bursting with pride and ambition for his daughter, insisted she should be named Georgiana in honor of the Prince Regent, or perhaps Charlotte after the lost princess. But the Prince Regent, who attended the christening, vetoed both suggestions with characteristic spite. The baby was instead christened Alexandrina, after her godfather Tsar Alexander I of Russia, with Victoria as a second name after her mother. The Duke of Kent never lived to see his daughter's destiny unfold. Just 8 months after Victoria's birth, he contracted pneumonia and died at the age of 52. The Duchess of Kent was left a widow in a foreign country, speaking little English, with a baby daughter and 2 older children from her first marriage. She had almost no money and was entirely dependent on the grudging financial support of the royal family, who regarded her as an inconvenient foreigner. When Victoria's infant cousin died in 1820 and George III passed away the same year, the child moved to 3rd in line to the throne, behind only her uncles George IV and William, Duke of Clarence. The young Victoria's childhood was dominated by what came to be known as the Kensington System, a rigid regime of control imposed by her mother and the Duchess's controller, an Irish adventurer named Sir John Conroy. Conroy had insinuated himself into the household and wielded enormous influence over the lonely, isolated Duchess. He convinced her that the royal family was hostile to her and to Victoria, and that they must keep the child under constant supervision and control. The system was designed, Conroy claimed, to keep Victoria safe and to prepare her for queenship, but it also served to isolate mother and daughter from the rest of the royal family, and to ensure that Conroy himself would be indispensable. Under this regime, Victoria was never allowed to be alone. She slept in her mother's bedroom every night. She could not walk downstairs without holding someone's hand. She was forbidden to meet people without her mother or Conroy present. Her lessons were carefully controlled, though she did receive a solid education in history, languages, and constitutional law from a governess, Baroness Lazen, who was one of the few people to show her genuine affection. The Duchess and Conroy organized an elaborate tour around England, ostensibly to introduce the young princess to her future subjects, but really to build support for the Duchess as a future regent, and for Conroy's own ambitions to become the power behind the throne. Victoria understood from an early age that she would likely become queen. According to her later accounts, when she was 11 years old, a genealogical table was slipped into her history book during a lesson, and upon studying it, she realized her position in the succession. She is said to have declared, "I will be good," a statement that may have been embellished in later retellings but which captured something essential about her sense of duty. What the Kensington system actually produced was not a pliant, controllable young woman, but one who was intensely determined to escape the suffocating control of her mother, and Conroy the moment she had the power to do so. The relationship between Victoria and her mother became increasingly strained as the princess grew older. Victoria's journals, which she began keeping as a young girl and maintained throughout her life, reveal a child who felt lonely and oppressed. She adored her half-sister Fedora, 12 years her senior, but was devastated when Fedora married and left England in 1828. She depended emotionally on Baroness Lazen, who remained her confidant and supporter. She detested Conroy, whom she saw clearly as a manipulative schemer interested only in power. In later years, Victoria would look back on her childhood with bitterness, remembering it as a time of isolation and unhappiness. As Victoria entered her teenage years, the question of when she would become queen grew more urgent. George IV died in 1830 and was succeeded by his brother William IV, a bluff, eccentric naval officer in his mid-60s. William had no surviving legitimate children, which meant that Victoria was now heir presumptive. The Duchess of Kent and Conroy stepped up their efforts to prepare for a regency, convinced that William would die before Victoria reached 18, the age of legal majority. They pressured Victoria to sign documents that would have given Conroy enormous power, but the stubborn princess refused, enduring what appears to have been sustained bullying and emotional abuse. The precise nature of what occurred remains debated by historians, but it is clear that the final years of Victoria's childhood were marked by a bitter struggle for control. King William IV, who had his own intense dislike of the Duchess of Kent, was determined to live long enough for Victoria to reach her majority and escape the need for a regency. In one famous incident at a public dinner, the king openly berated the Duchess, declaring his hope that he would survive until Victoria was 18 so that the regency would never fall into the Duchess's incompetent hands. It was an extraordinary public breach of royal decorum, but it reflected the toxic family dynamics that surrounded the young heir to the throne. Victoria's childhood, oppressive and lonely as it was, shaped the monarch she would become. She learned early the importance of asserting her own will against those who sought to control her. She developed a fierce sense of independence and a deep distrust of anyone who might try to manipulate her for their own ends. She understood the weight of duty and the expectations placed upon her, and she learned to keep her own counsel, to hide her feelings behind a mask of composure, and to trust very few people completely. These lessons, learned in the shabby rooms of Kensington Palace under the rigid control of the Kensington System, would define her approach to monarchy for the next 6 decades. Sources used. Victoria. A Life by A. N. Wilson. Pages 743 Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford. Pages 2156 Victoria R.I. by Christopher Hibbert. Pages 135 Victoria. The Queen by Julia Baird. Pages 1148 Queen Victoria by Cecil Woodham-Smith. Pages 79-132 Part 2. A young queen takes the throne in the early hours of June 20th, 1837. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain arrived at Kensington Palace and insisted on being admitted immediately despite the hour. They were shown to an upstairs room where they waited while the young Princess Victoria was woken and told to dress quickly. She came down in her nightgown and dressing gown, her hair loose, and was informed that King William IV had died at Windsor Castle in the early morning hours. She was now Queen Victoria. sovereign of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. At just 18 years old, Victoria's first actions as queen revealed the determined character that her constrained childhood had forged. She received the Archbishop and Lord Chamberlain alone, having specifically requested that her mother not be present. It was a deliberate assertion of her new independence. Later that morning, she met with her Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, and again insisted on meeting him privately. When her mother assumed she would continue to share a bedroom with her daughter as she had throughout Victoria's entire life, the new queen firmly informed her that she would now sleep alone. These might seem like small gestures, but they represented a revolutionary break from the Kensington System and announced to everyone, especially to the Duchess of Kent and John Conroy, that Victoria intended to rule in her own right. The young queen was small in stature, barely 5 feet tall, but she possessed a natural dignity and sense of authority that impressed those who met her. Charles Greville, the famous diarist and clerk of the Privy Council, attended her first Privy Council meeting and recorded his surprise at her composure. The room was filled with elderly statesmen and dignitaries, including several royal dukes who might have expected to dominate the proceedings. Instead, Victoria conducted herself with perfect decorum, reading her declaration in a clear voice and managing the complex ceremony without error. Greville wrote that she appeared perfectly composed and not the least nervous, and that her behavior was marked by extraordinary dignity and propriety. Victoria was fortunate in her first Prime Minister. William Lamb, Viscount Melbourne, was a sophisticated Whig politician of 58, worldly and intelligent, who had survived personal scandals and political battles. He became not just Victoria's chief minister, but her close companion and mentor, dining with her almost daily and spending hours in her company. Melbourne guided Victoria through the complex world of constitutional monarchy, explaining political issues, discussing policy, and helping her understand the delicate balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary government. For the young queen, who had been starved of trusted adult guidance, Melbourne became a father figure, and she became deeply attached to him. The relationship between Victoria and Melbourne was entirely proper, but it was also intensely close, and it created political complications. Britain in the late 1830s was in a period of significant political transition. The Reform Act of 1832 had expanded the electorate and reduced the power of traditional aristocratic interests, though Britain was still very far from a democracy. The Whigs under Melbourne represented gradual reform and the interests of commercial and industrial England. The Tories, now beginning to call themselves Conservatives under Robert Peel, were becoming more organized in opposition. Victoria's obvious affection for Melbourne and her identification with the Whig cause compromised her position as a monarch who was supposed to stand above party politics. This became dramatically clear in 1839 when Melbourne's government lost its parliamentary majority and resigned. Robert Peel, as leader of the Conservatives, was asked to form a government, and he requested that Victoria replace some of the Whig ladies of her bedchamber with Conservative women, as was traditional when a new government took office. Victoria, who saw these ladies as her personal attendants and friends, refused absolutely. She regarded the request as an intrusion into her private household and an attempt to force her to dismiss women she trusted. The confrontation escalated into what became known as the bedchamber crisis. Peel, unwilling to take office under such conditions and unable to command the Queen's confidence, declined to form a government. Melbourne and the Whigs returned to power, though their parliamentary position remained weak. Historians have debated whether Victoria was constitutionally correct to refuse Peel's request or whether she overstepped her role. The most widely accepted interpretation is that Victoria, influenced by Melbourne and by her own inexperience and stubbornness, made a mistake that revealed her lack of political maturity. She had allowed personal feelings to interfere with constitutional duty. The incident demonstrated the tensions inherent in the British system of constitutional monarchy, where the sovereign retained significant theoretical powers, but was increasingly expected to act only on ministerial advice. The bedchamber crisis also revealed how isolated Victoria remained. She had broken free from her mother and Conroy, banishing the latter from court and keeping the Duchess at arm's length, but she had few close relationships beyond Melbourne and Baroness Lazen. The British public, initially enchanted by their young queen, was beginning to have doubts. Victoria was criticized for her partisanship, for her extravagance, and for her apparent lack of understanding of the lives of ordinary subjects. The early Victorian period was one of severe social hardship for many. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Britain into the workshop of the world, but it was also creating terrible urban poverty, harsh working conditions, and social unrest. The Chartist movement was demanding political reforms including universal male suffrage, and there were genuine fears of revolution similar to those convulsing continental Europe. Victoria herself was still learning what it meant to be queen. She enjoyed the social aspects of her role, the balls and banquets, the opera and theater, the beautiful gowns and jewels. She was less interested in the tedious business of reading government papers and attending to official duties, though Melbourne insisted she do so. She had strong opinions and expressed them forcefully in private, but she did not yet understand the limits of constitutional monarchy. The Queen had the right to be consulted, to encourage, and to warn, as the constitutional theorist Walter Bagehot would later famously describe, but increasingly she did not have the right to decide. The late 1830s also saw Victoria grappling with family complications. Her mother remained at court, living in the same palace but barely speaking to her daughter. Conroy finally left the royal household in 1839 after receiving a substantial financial settlement, but the damage to Victoria's relationship with her mother lasted for years. Victoria was also meeting various eligible princes in what everyone understood was a search for a suitable husband. As a ruling queen, she could not be married to just anyone. Her consort would need to be of appropriate royal rank, Protestant or willing to convert, and acceptable to the British government and people. In October 1839, Victoria's first cousin Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha visited England for the second time. They had met briefly in 1836 when both were teenagers, but this visit was different. Victoria was now queen, and Albert was being presented as a potential husband. Within days of his arrival, Victoria found herself falling deeply in love. She later wrote in her journal about his beauty, his perfection, and how she felt when she looked at him. On October 15th, just 5 days after Albert's arrival, Victoria summoned him to her room and proposed marriage. As queen, the proposal had to come from her, not from him. Albert accepted, and Victoria's life was about to change in ways she could not have imagined. Sources used. Victoria R.I. by Christopher Hibbert. Pages 36-78 Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford. Pages 57-119 Victoria. A Life by A. N. Wilson. Pages 44-97 Victoria. The Queen by Julia Baird. Pages 49-112 The Oxford History of Britain. Pages 512-527 Part 3. Love, Marriage and Family. Queen Victoria married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha on February 10, 1840, in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace. She wore a white satin gown trimmed with orange blossoms, establishing a fashion for white wedding dresses that would endure. The ceremony was relatively modest by royal standards, as Parliament had been reluctant to grant Albert a generous income or even a high rank in the British peerage, reflecting continuing British suspicion of foreign princes. Albert was not made a British peer, was not granted precedence over other members of the royal family, and received an annuity smaller than that given to previous royal consorts. These slights stung both Victoria and Albert deeply. The marriage transformed Victoria's life and reign. Albert was just 3 months younger than Victoria, born in August 1819. He had been carefully educated at the University of Bonn and was serious-minded, intellectual, and deeply committed to moral improvement and public duty. He was in many ways the opposite of the pleasure-loving, often dissolute male members of the British royal family. Where Victoria was emotional and impulsive, Albert was rational and methodical. Where she loved the social whirl of court life, he found much of it frivolous and exhausting. Yet they complemented each other remarkably well, and the love that had struck Victoria so suddenly deepened into a genuine partnership. In the early months of their marriage, however, there were significant tensions. Victoria was the queen and was intensely possessive of her royal authority. She had no intention of allowing her husband to dominate her, as wives in the 19th century were normally expected to submit to their husbands. Albert was given no official role or responsibilities. He was not allowed to see state papers or attend meetings with ministers. Baroness Leyson, Victoria's childhood governess and companion, still wielded enormous influence over the Queen and ran the royal household, and she viewed Albert with suspicion and resentment. The situation was deeply frustrating for Albert, who was ambitious, capable, and understandably expected to play some role in public affairs. The birth of their first child, Princess Victoria, in November 1840, brought matters to a head. The Queen suffered from what appears to have been postpartum depression, experiencing mood swings, outbursts of temper, and profound unhappiness. The household was in chaos, with Leyson and Albert in open conflict over who should make decisions about the baby's care and the running of the royal residences. Finally, in 1842, Albert confronted Victoria with evidence of mismanagement and financial irregularities in the household. Victoria, faced with a choice between her husband and her former governess, chose Albert. Leyson was pensioned off and left England, never to return. It was a turning point in the marriage and in Albert's position. From 1842 onward, Albert became Victoria's essential partner in the business of monarchy. He was given access to state papers and began to attend meetings with ministers. He read and summarized documents for Victoria, drafted memoranda, and advised on policy. Crucially, he did all this behind the scenes, never claiming executive power for himself but working always in Victoria's name. He was, in effect, her private secretary and chief advisor, but he held no official position. This arrangement suited the constitutional requirements of the time while allowing Albert to exercise real influence. Albert threw himself into public causes with characteristic energy and moral seriousness. He championed educational reform, supported the arts and sciences, and involved himself in efforts to improve housing and working conditions for the poor. He became president or patron of numerous societies and institutions. He was deeply concerned with Britain's industrial and technological progress, and he conceived the idea of a great exhibition that would showcase Britain's achievements and promote international trade and understanding. This vision would become the Great Exhibition of 1851, but it emerged from Albert's genuine belief in progress, peace, and the moral improvement of society through science and industry. Victoria and Albert's family life was equally consuming. Between 1840 and 1857, Victoria gave birth to 9 children. Victoria, Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, Alice, Alfred, Helena, Louise, Arthur, Leopold, and Beatrice. Victoria did not enjoy being pregnant, and her journals contain frank complaints about the physical discomfort and the interruption to her activities. She was not naturally maternal and found Bobbies somewhat tedious, preferring her children when they were older and could converse intelligently. But she was deeply committed to family life and to the idea of the royal family as a model of domestic virtue. This emphasis on respectability and family values was revolutionary for the British monarchy. The Hanoverian kings had been notorious for their mistresses, illegitimate children, and scandalous private lives. George IV's marriage had been a catastrophic public disaster. William IV had lived openly with an actress and fathered 10 illegitimate children before marrying late in life. Victoria and Albert deliberately cultivated a different image. They were devoted to each other, faithful, and centered on their children. They purchased Osborne House on the Isle of Wight and Balmoral Castle in Scotland as private family retreats where they could escape the formality of court life. Albert designed improvements to both properties, and the royal family spent holidays there in relative informality. The public responded positively to this domestic image. Prints and photographs of the royal family became popular, showing Victoria and Albert with their children in settings that emphasized their ordinariness despite their royal status. They helped make the monarchy respectable and relatable in a way it had not been for generations. This was particularly important as Britain continued its transformation into an industrial, urban, middle-class society. The monarchy needed to adapt to survive, and Victoria and Albert's emphasis on duty, morality, and family life resonated with Victorian middle-class values. Yet there were contradictions and complexities beneath this polished surface. Victoria could be a difficult, demanding partner, subject to fierce temper tantrums and periods of unreasonableness. Albert, for all his virtues, could be cold and priggish, and he sometimes seemed more concerned with abstract principles than with people's feelings. The couple argued, sometimes bitterly, though they always reconciled. Victoria's emotional dependence on Albert was intense, perhaps unhealthily so. She relied on him for everything, consulted him on every decision, and could barely function without him. Their approach to raising their children was strict and often harsh by modern standards, though not unusual for their time and class. Albert, in particular, believed in rigorous education and moral discipline. The children were subjected to demanding schedules of lessons and were harshly criticized for any failings. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, suffered particularly under this regime. He was not academically gifted and could not meet his father's exacting standards, leading to a difficult and sometimes cruel relationship that left lasting psychological scars. Victoria and Albert also began the practice of marrying their children into European royal families, a strategy that was partly political and partly personal. Their eldest daughter Vicky married the Prussian crown prince in 1858, eventually becoming German empress. Other children married into the Russian, Romanian, and various German royal families. These marriages spread Victoria's descendants across European thrones and earned her the nickname Grandmother of Europe, though some historians have questioned whether this dynastic web actually contributed to European peace or merely created the illusion of family unity while national interests diverged. By 1851, after more than a decade of marriage, Victoria and Albert had established a model of constitutional monarchy that blended traditional royal authority with modern restraint, public duty with private domesticity. Albert had transformed himself from a foreign prince with no role into an indispensable advisor and a respected public figure. Victoria had matured from an inexperienced girl into a capable monarch and devoted wife. Their partnership reshaped the British monarchy and created an image of royal family life that would influence expectations for generations. But this image, while based on genuine affection and shared values, was also carefully constructed and maintained. The reality of their marriage and family life was more complicated and sometimes more troubled than the official portraits suggested. Sources used. Victoria. The Queen by Julia Baird, pages 113–201, Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford, pages 120–228, Victoria, R.I., by Christopher Hibbert, pages 79–166, Victoria. A Life by A. N. Wilson, pages Victoria by Cecil Woodham-Smith, pages 185–267, Part 4. The Queen of an Expanding Empire, the Britain over which Queen Victoria reigned in the middle decades of the 19th century, was undergoing a transformation more profound than any in its history. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the late 18th century, was now in full flood. Britain was becoming the workshop of the world, producing more coal, iron, steel, and textiles than any other nation. Factories spread across the Midlands and the North. Railways crisscrossed the country, shrinking distances and revolutionizing commerce. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham and Leeds exploded in size, drawing hundreds of thousands from the countryside into crowded urban slums where they labored in conditions of extraordinary hardship. This economic transformation was accompanied by social upheaval and political reform. The middle classes, enriched by industry and commerce, demanded greater political power and got it through the Reform Acts of 1832 and 1867, which gradually expanded the electorate. The working classes organized through trade unions and movements like Chartism, demanding rights and protections. Britain in Victoria's reign was a society in constant motion, marked by extraordinary creativity and innovation, but also by deep inequalities and recurring crises. Victoria and Albert viewed these changes with a mixture of pride and concern. They genuinely believed in progress and in Britain's destiny to lead the world toward civilization and improvement. This belief found its most spectacular expression in the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in the specially constructed Crystal Palace in Hyde Park. The exhibition was Albert's great project, conceived and driven forward against considerable skepticism and opposition. It brought together exhibits from around the world, showcasing industrial machinery, artistic achievements, and the products of British manufacturing and imperial trade. The Great Exhibition was an enormous success. Over 6 million people visited during its 5 months, astonishing in an era when most working people had neither the time nor money for such outings. Special rail excursions brought visitors from across Britain. The Crystal Palace itself, a revolutionary building of glass and iron designed by Joseph Paxton, became a symbol of British ingenuity and the possibilities of the modern age. Victoria visited repeatedly, and her journal entries convey her genuine excitement and pride. The exhibition made a substantial profit, which was used to purchase land in South Kensington for museums and educational institutions that still exist today. Yet, even as Britain celebrated its industrial and commercial dominance, its empire was expanding on a scale unprecedented in history. When Victoria became queen in 1837, Britain already controlled significant territories in India, Canada, the Caribbean, and southern Africa. By the end of her reign in 1901, the British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and governed a quarter of its population. This expansion was driven by a complex mixture of economic interests, strategic calculation, missionary zeal, and a sense of racial and cultural superiority that was pervasive in Victorian Britain. Victoria's personal role in imperial expansion was limited by the constraints of constitutional monarchy. She did not decide to annex territories or wage wars. Those decisions were made by her governments, advised by military and colonial officials, and approved by Parliament. But Victoria took a keen interest in imperial affairs and expressed strong opinions on them. Her journals and correspondence reveal genuine concern for the welfare of her subjects overseas, both British settlers and indigenous populations, though her views were thoroughly shaped by the assumptions of her time about British superiority and the benefits of British rule. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, known at the time as the Indian Mutiny, was a watershed moment both for British India and for Victoria herself. The rebellion began among Indian soldiers in the British East India Company's army and spread across large parts of northern and central India. The causes were complex, including religious grievances, economic exploitation, and resentment of British cultural arrogance. The suppression of the rebellion was marked by atrocities on both sides, including the massacre of British women and children at Cawnpore and brutal British reprisals including mass executions. Victoria followed events closely and with great emotion. She was horrified by accounts of violence against British subjects, but also insisted that Indian people should not be collectively blamed or punished. She wrote to her ministers urging clemency and expressing the view that British rule should be characterized by justice and respect for Indian customs and religions. These were conventional sentiments for a constitutional monarch, but they reflected Victoria's genuine feelings. When the East India Company's rule was ended, and India was brought under direct crown control in 1858, Victoria took her role as sovereign of India seriously. In 1876, at the urging of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India. The title was controversial in Britain, where many saw it as foreign and un-British, smacking of continental autocracy. Victoria herself was delighted with it, partly from vanity, but also because she felt it properly reflected the importance of India and elevated her status to match other emperors. The proclamation was celebrated with great ceremony in Delhi, though Victoria herself never visited India, something she always regretted. Victoria's relationship with her prime ministers during these middle decades of her reign shaped British politics and the evolving role of constitutional monarchy. She worked with a succession of liberal and conservative governments, and her preferences were clear. She disliked William Gladstone, the great liberal leader who served 4 terms as prime minister between 1868 and 1894. Victoria found Gladstone pompous, self-righteous, and too radical in his reforming zeal. Gladstone, a deeply religious and moralistic man, addressed the Queen as though she were a public meeting, lecturing rather than conversing. The Queen complained that he spoke to her as though she were an institution rather than a person. By contrast, Victoria adored Benjamin Disraeli, the conservative leader who served as prime minister in 1868 and again from 1874 to 1880. Disraeli understood how to manage the Queen. He flattered her, consulted her, shared gossip, and treated her as a woman rather than just a sovereign. He wrote her charming letters and showed her genuine respect while also subtly guiding her toward supporting his policies. Disraeli was a shrewd politician who understood that keeping the Queen's goodwill gave him advantages over his liberal rivals. Victoria's preference for Disraeli and her dislike of Gladstone were widely known and represented a failure to maintain proper constitutional impartiality, though both men were too skilled to exploit the situation publicly. The expansion of the empire and Britain's industrial dominance brought enormous wealth to some parts of British society, but also created moral and political dilemmas. The wealth was built partly on the exploitation of colonial resources and labor, on unequal trade relationships, and on military conquest. At home, the benefits of industrial growth were very unevenly distributed. While the middle classes prospered, industrial workers endured long hours, dangerous conditions, and poverty wages. Social reformers documented the terrible conditions in factories, mines, and urban slums. And gradually, Britain began to pass legislation regulating working conditions, improving public health, and expanding education. Victoria supported many of these reforms in principle, but her political views were fundamentally conservative. She believed in hierarchy, duty, and the preservation of traditional institutions, including the monarchy and the aristocracy. She was suspicious of democracy and of the extension of the franchise to working-class men, though she accepted reforms when they were presented as necessary and gradual. She had little understanding of the lives of her poorest subjects, and sometimes expressed views that modern historians find shockingly callous, such as her belief that the poor were partly responsible for their own condition through lack of moral character. Yet Victoria also showed genuine compassion on many occasions. She visited hospitals, supported charities, and took an interest in individual cases of hardship. She believed that the monarchy had a duty to set a moral example and to show concern for all subjects. This was part of the domestication of monarchy that she and Albert had promoted. The Queen was to be a symbol of national unity, standing above party politics and representing the whole nation. In practice, Victoria's strong political opinions and her favoritism toward particular ministers and parties compromised this ideal, but the ideal itself was important in shaping the modern British monarchy. By the 1860s, Victoria was at the height of her influence and prestige. She was the matriarch of a large family, the sovereign of an expanding empire, and the symbol of a nation that saw itself as leading the world in industry, commerce, and civilization. Albert was her indispensable partner, managing her affairs and guiding her judgment. Their model of constitutional monarchy seemed secure, but tragedy was about to strike that would plunge Victoria into a period of withdrawal so profound it would threaten the monarchy itself. Sources used: **The Cambridge History of the British Empire, Volume III, pages 184–279 Victoria. A Life by A. N. Wilson, pages 188–284 Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford, pages 229–337 Victoria R.I. by Christopher Hibbert, pages 167–247 The Victorians by A. N. Wilson, pages 87–156 Part 5. Tragedy, Isolation, and Return on December 14, 1861. Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle at the age of 42. The official cause was typhoid fever, though modern medical historians have suggested he may have been suffering from a longer-term illness, possibly chronic stomach disease or even cancer. His death devastated Victoria completely. She had depended on Albert for everything, consulted him on every decision, and structured her entire life around their partnership. Now he was gone, and she was inconsolable. Victoria's grief was extreme even by the standards of an age that ritualized mourning. She wore black for the rest of her life, more than 40 years. She ordered that Albert's rooms be kept exactly as they were at the moment of his death, with his clothes laid out and hot water brought for shaving every morning. She had photographs taken of his corpse and kept locks of his hair. She commissioned monuments, memorials, and statues of Albert across Britain and the Empire. The most famous, the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, is a massive Gothic structure that reflects both Victoria's love and the Victorian taste for elaborate public monuments. But Victoria's grief went beyond personal mourning into something approaching psychological collapse. She withdrew almost completely from public life. She refused to perform ceremonial duties, to open Parliament in person, or to appear at public events. She left London and spent most of her time at Windsor, Osborne, or Balmoral, seeing almost no one outside her immediate household. She continued to read government papers and to carry out the essential business of monarchy, signing documents and meeting privately with ministers, but she would not show herself to her subjects. This withdrawal lasted not months but years. By the late 1860s, public criticism of the Queen was mounting. Republicans argued that if she would not perform her duties, the monarchy should be abolished. Radical politicians and newspapers questioned why the nation should pay for a queen who remained invisible. There were public meetings demanding the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a republic. In 1871, when Victoria was 52, the Republican movement reached its peak. Prominent figures, including the radical politician Sir Charles Dilke, made speeches calling for the end of the monarchy. The crisis passed partly because of luck and partly because of shrewd political management. In 1871, the Prince of Wales fell seriously ill with typhoid, the same disease that had killed his father. For several days his life was in danger, and public sympathy swung back toward the royal family. When he recovered, a public Thanksgiving service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral, which Victoria attended, and she was greeted with genuine enthusiasm. The following year, a young man attempted to assassinate the Queen as her carriage left Buckingham Palace. The attempt was bungled and the Queen unharmed, but public outrage at the attack generated a wave of loyalty. The Republican movement faded, though it had given the monarchy a genuine fright. Victoria's long seclusion was made more controversial by her relationships with two male servants, both of which became the subject of rumors and scandal. The first was John Brown, a Scottish servant from Balmoral who had served Albert and whom Victoria promoted to become her personal attendant, or Highland servant, after Albert's death. Brown was rough-mannered, blunt, and often rude, but Victoria relied on him completely. He managed her daily routine, accompanied her on rides and walks, and was granted extraordinary privileges, including the right to enter her rooms without announcement. The nature of Victoria's relationship with John Brown has been debated by historians for over a century. Contemporary gossip suggested everything from a secret marriage to a sexual affair. Newspapers called her Mrs. Brown in thinly veiled satire. Members of the royal family and the court establishment despised Brown and resented his influence. The most widely accepted scholarly interpretation is that the relationship was not sexual, but was emotionally intense and inappropriate in ways that damaged Victoria's reputation. Brown treated Victoria as a person rather than as a queen, which she found comforting after Albert's death, but his presence and behavior fed damaging rumors and contributed to the perception that the queen had lost her judgment. Brown died in 1883, and Victoria mourned him deeply, though not with the overwhelming grief that Albert's death had provoked. She immediately began another controversial relationship, this time with an Indian servant named Abdul Karim, whom she called her Munchie or teacher. Karim had come to England for Victoria's Golden Jubilee in 1887 and caught the Queen's attention. She promoted him rapidly, learned Urdu from him, and consulted him on matters relating to India. She gave him extraordinary privileges and defended him fiercely against criticism. The Munchie affair provoked even more intense opposition than the John Brown relationship had. Members of the royal household and Victoria's own children regarded Karim with suspicion and resentment. There were allegations that he was passing information to Indian nationalists, though these were never proven. The opposition to Karim had clear elements of racism and snobbery. The British establishment could not accept an Indian servant having such close access to the Queen. Modern historians debate Karim's actual influence and character, with some arguing he was unfairly maligned, and others suggesting Victoria's judgment was clouded by her romanticized view of India and her need for companionship. What both relationships reveal is Victoria's isolation and her need for undemanding personal connection. After Albert's death, she was surrounded by people who deferred to her as queen but could not relate to her as a person. Brown and Karim both treated her with a directness that was refreshing to her, even if it was scandalous to others. These relationships also show the limits of Victoria's power. She could insist on keeping Brown and Karim despite widespread opposition, but she could not prevent the damage to her reputation or silence the criticism. Victoria's gradual return to fuller public engagement in the 1870s and 1880s coincided with two major celebrations that marked milestones in her reign. The Golden Jubilee in 1887 celebrated 50 years since her accession, and the Diamond Jubilee in 1897 marked 60 years. Both were occasions for spectacular public pageantry and for demonstrations of imperial power and unity. Representatives came from across the empire, and processions through London showed Victoria to crowds of cheering subjects. The Diamond Jubilee in particular was a massive imperial celebration. The procession included troops from every part of the empire, a visible demonstration of British global power. Victoria, now 78 and in frail health, was unable to walk and traveled in an open carriage through streets lined with millions of spectators. The celebration was broadcast by the new technologies of telegraph and early cinema, spreading images of the event worldwide. For many Victorians, it seemed a triumphant validation of British imperial destiny and of the Queen who had come to symbolize the age. Yet behind the pageantry, Britain was facing growing challenges. Competition from Germany and the United States was eroding British industrial dominance. The empire faced resistance and rebellion in various territories. At home, the extension of the franchise and the rise of trade unions were creating new political forces that challenged traditional power structures. Victoria herself was increasingly out of touch with these changes. She remained conservative in her political views, suspicious of democracy, and wedded to an idealized vision of social hierarchy and imperial mission. Victoria's later years were marked by further personal losses and declining health. Many of her closest friends and family members died, including John Brown, Benjamin Disraeli, and several of her children. She suffered from rheumatism and had difficulty walking. But she continued to work, reading government papers and conducting official business until near the end of her life. She also continued to exert political influence, expressing strong opinions on appointments and policies, though she was increasingly ignored by ministers who understood that her views represented an earlier era. The Queen, who had once hidden herself away in grief, had become, in her final years, a visible symbol of national continuity and imperial grandeur. Her 2 jubilees had demonstrated genuine public affection and had secured the monarchy's position for another generation. But the very length of her reign was creating problems. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was nearly 60 years old and had spent his entire adult life waiting to become king, often at odds with his mother and excluded from meaningful responsibilities. The Victorian era had lasted so long that it was becoming difficult to imagine Britain without Victoria, yet change was inevitable. Sources used. Victoria. The Queen by Julia Baird, pages 348–491, Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford, pages 338–512, Victoria, R.I. by Christopher Hibbert, pages 248–389, Victoria. A Life by A. N. Wilson, pages 285–437, Queen Victoria by Cecil Woodham-Smith, pages 378–456, Part 6. The woman behind the crown. To understand Queen Victoria as a person, rather than just as a historical symbol, requires looking beyond the official portraits and state occasions to examine her personality, her beliefs, and her private life. Victoria was a woman of intense emotions and strong opinions who struggled throughout her life to reconcile her personal feelings with the demands of her constitutional role. Physically, Victoria was small and plump, standing barely 5 feet tall in her youth and becoming considerably heavier in middle and old age. In her early years, she was considered attractive, with large blue eyes, a clear complexion, and a pretty smile. She had a love of fashion and spent considerable sums on clothing and jewelry. She enjoyed dancing, riding, and music, and she had a particular passion for opera. She was fluent in several languages, including German, French, and Italian, and she learned some Urdu late in life. She was an accomplished artist, producing hundreds of sketches and watercolors throughout her life, many of which show genuine talent. Victoria's personality was marked by contradictions. She could be warm, affectionate, and charming, with a genuine interest in people and their lives. She had a good sense of humor and enjoyed gossip and conversation, but she could also be imperious, demanding, and unreasonable. She was subject to fierce temper tantrums, especially in her younger years, during which she would shout and sometimes throw objects. She had very strong likes and dislikes and was often incapable of seeing another person's point of view. She demanded absolute loyalty from those around her and could be unforgiving toward those she felt had betrayed her. Her political views were thoroughly conservative, shaped by her position at the apex of British society and by her belief in traditional social order. She believed in monarchy, aristocracy, and the established church. She was deeply opposed to democracy, regarding the extension of voting rights to working-class men as dangerous and likely to lead to social chaos. She had conventional views on women's role in society and famously opposed women's suffrage, despite being herself the most powerful woman in the world. She believed women were naturally suited for domestic life and motherhood and should not involve themselves in politics or public affairs. This apparent contradiction, a female monarch who opposed women's political participation, troubled Victoria herself. She occasionally wrote about the anomaly of her position, recognizing that her authority as queen sat uneasily with her beliefs about women's proper sphere. She resolved the tension partly by emphasizing that her position was unique and divinely ordained, and partly by insisting that she performed her duties only with male guidance, first from Melbourne, then from Albert, and later from various private secretaries and ministers. Victoria's religious faith was genuine and important to her, though it was conventional rather than intense. She was a devout member of the Church of England and took seriously her role as its supreme governor. She attended services regularly and said private prayers. She believed firmly in divine providence, in an afterlife where she would be reunited with Albert, and in the moral teachings of Christianity. She had little tolerance for other religious traditions and regarded Catholicism with suspicion, though she recognized the religious diversity of her empire and insisted on tolerance in official policy. The role of grandmother of Europe became increasingly important in Victoria's later life. Through the marriages of her 9 children, Victoria's descendants spread across European royal houses. Her eldest daughter Vicky married the German crown Prince Frederick, who briefly became Emperor Frederick III before dying of throat cancer. Their son became Kaiser Wilhelm II, making him Victoria's grandson. Victoria's second daughter Alice married the Grand Duke of Hesse, and their descendants included the last Tsarina of Russia. Victoria's son Alfred married into the Russian imperial family, and various other children and grandchildren married into the royal families of Prussia, Romania, Spain, and elsewhere. Victoria corresponded voluminously with her children and grandchildren, offering advice, criticism, and family news. She saw these dynastic connections as creating bonds between nations and hoped they would promote peace. In practice, the bonds of family proved weaker than national interests, and Victoria's descendants would find themselves on opposite sides in the First World War. But the network of relationships did give Victoria unique insights into European affairs and made her a significant informal diplomatic presence. Victoria's daily life, especially after Albert's death, followed rigid routines. She rose early and worked through government papers and correspondence with her private secretary. She received ministers and officials in audiences. She took daily walks or carriage rides. She dined in private or with small family groups. She spent evenings reading, working on her journals, or being read to. She divided her time between her official residences, Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace, and her beloved private retreats at Osborne on the Isle of Wight and Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands. The journals Victoria kept throughout her adult life are an invaluable historical source, running to millions of words. She wrote in them almost daily, recording events, meetings, and her reactions and feelings. After her death, her youngest daughter Beatrice, acting as Victoria's literary executor, edited the journals heavily, copying out selected portions and destroying the originals. This act of censorship has frustrated historians, as we can never know what Beatrice removed. What survives shows a woman who was observant, opinionated, often self-absorbed, and capable of both insight and extraordinary blindness about herself and her actions. Victoria's relationship with her children was complex and often troubled. She was not a naturally maternal woman and found Bobbies boring and young children tiresome. She was capable of great affection, but also of harshness and criticism. She had favorites among her children, particularly her youngest daughter Beatrice, whom she kept at her side as a companion and secretary, and Prince Arthur, who followed a military career. She had difficult relationships with others, especially the Prince of Wales, whom she blamed unfairly for causing Albert's final illness through his involvement in a scandal shortly before Albert's death. The children married and established their own households, but Victoria continued to try to control their lives, offering constant advice and criticism. She disapproved of many of their spouses and was often disappointed by their choices and behavior. The children, for their part, found their mother demanding and difficult. Several of them, particularly the Prince of Wales, simply avoided her when possible and lived their own lives largely outside her influence. Victoria complained in her journals about feeling neglected by her children, apparently without recognizing that her behavior often drove them away. Victoria's influence on the institution of monarchy was profound and lasting. She transformed the British royal family from a dynasty associated with scandal and excess into a symbol of domestic virtue and moral propriety. She established the pattern of royal family life that would continue through her successors, with a clear separation between public ceremonial duties and private family time. She showed that the monarchy could adapt to constitutional government and reduced royal powers while remaining symbolically important and genuinely popular. Yet Victoria also represented continuity with older models of monarchy. She believed firmly in royal prerogative and actively resisted the reduction of the monarch's role to purely ceremonial status. She fought to preserve the sovereign's right to be consulted on appointments, policy, and legislation. She used her position to promote policies and politicians she favored and to obstruct those she opposed. Later constitutional theorists would argue that she overstepped the proper boundaries of constitutional monarchy, but in her own time her actions were generally accepted, partly because she worked behind the scenes, and partly because even her political opponents recognized her dedication and experience. As Victoria entered her final years, she had become a living embodiment of an entire era. To her subjects, both in Britain and across the empire, she had always been queen. The Victorian age was defined by her presence, her values, and her longevity. She had witnessed extraordinary changes. Britain transformed from an agricultural to an industrial society. The empire expanded to cover a quarter of the globe. Science and technology revolutionized daily life, and political power shifted gradually from the aristocracy to the middle classes and eventually to working men. Through all these changes, Victoria remained a constant presence, a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Sources used. Victoria. The Queen by Julia Baird, pages 202-347, 492-547. Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford, pages 513-602. Victoria, R.I. by Christopher Hibbert, pages 390-448. Victoria. A Life by A. N. Wilson, pages 438-524. Victoria's Daughters by Gerald M. Packard, pages 54-187. Part 7. Death and the Victorian Legacy. As the 19th century drew to a close, Queen Victoria's health began to fail. She suffered from rheumatism and had increasing difficulty walking, eventually requiring a wheelchair. Her eyesight deteriorated, making it difficult to read the government documents she had studied diligently throughout her reign. She experienced aphasia, or difficulty with speech, following a series of small strokes. Yet she continued to work, to receive ministers and officials, and to maintain the routines that had structured her life for decades. The final year of Victoria's life coincided with the Boer War in South Africa, a brutal conflict between British forces and Boer settlers that exposed weaknesses in the British military and generated international criticism. Victoria followed the war closely and was distressed by British defeats and casualties. She visited wounded soldiers and knitted scarves for troops. Her concern was genuine, though she showed little understanding of the war's underlying causes or the brutality with which it was being fought. In January 1901, Victoria traveled to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, as was her custom. Her health declined rapidly. She suffered a series of strokes that left her unable to speak clearly. Her children and grandchildren were summoned, and they gathered at Osborne as it became clear the end was near. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, Victoria's eldest grandson, arrived and was present at her deathbed. On January 22, 1901, surrounded by her family, Queen Victoria died at the age of 81. She had reigned for 63 years and 7 months, the longest reign in British history up to that point. Victoria's death marked the end of an era in the most literal sense. The Victorian age, which had lasted for more than 6 decades, was over. The news was received with genuine grief across Britain and the Empire. Flags were lowered to half-mast, public events were cancelled, and millions donned black mourning dress. Even those who had criticized Victoria or questioned the relevance of monarchy recognized that something fundamental had changed. An entire generation had known no other monarch, and many people struggled to imagine Britain without Queen Victoria. The funeral, held on February 2, 1901, was an enormous state occasion that reflected both Victoria's personal wishes and the imperial grandeur of the age. Victoria had left detailed instructions for her funeral, insisting on a military rather than a purely civilian ceremony, and specifying that she wanted white rather than black decorations, seeing her death as a reunion with Albert rather than a tragedy. Her body was dressed in her wedding veil with Albert's dressing gown placed beside her in the coffin, along with photographs of Albert and other loved ones, locks of hair from her children, and secretly placed by her doctor according to her instructions, a photograph of John Brown and a lock of his hair. The funeral procession moved from Osborne to the royal yacht, then to London, and finally to Windsor for burial. Kings, emperors, and princes from across Europe attended, a gathering of royal power that would never be repeated in quite the same way. The crowned heads of Europe followed Victoria's coffin through the streets of London and Windsor. Among them was her son, now King Edward VII, aged 59, and finally ascending the throne after the longest wait of any heir in British history. Victoria was buried beside Prince Albert in the Frogmore Mausoleum at Windsor, the resting place she had prepared decades earlier. Edward VII's accession marked not just a change of monarch but a change of style and era. Edward, known as Bertie in the family, was everything his mother had not been: pleasure-loving, sociable, worldly, and modern. Where Victoria had withdrawn from society, Edward embraced it. Where she had been moralistic and proper, he was known for his affairs and his love of gambling and entertainment. The Edwardian age that followed would be brief, lasting only until 1910, but it represented a deliberate break from Victorian solemnity and moral strictness. The legacy of Queen Victoria and the Victorian age is complex and contested. To her contemporaries and to early 20th century historians, Victoria embodied progress, civilization, and the triumph of British power and values. The Victorian age was seen as a golden era when Britain led the world in industry, commerce, science, and empire. Victoria herself was credited with restoring the monarchy's reputation and making it a symbol of stability and national unity. This positive assessment began to be questioned in the mid-20th century as the British Empire dissolved, and as historians examined the costs of Victorian progress. The industrial wealth that Victorian Britain celebrated had been built on the exploitation of workers who labored in terrible conditions for poverty wages. The empire that covered a quarter of the world had been acquired through military conquest and was maintained through often brutal suppression of resistance. The Victorian emphasis on moral propriety coexisted with extraordinary hypocrisy, including widespread prostitution, child labor, and the relegation of women to subordinate status. Modern historians have offered more nuanced assessments of both Victoria and her age. They recognize Victoria's genuine dedication to duty and her success in adapting the monarchy to constitutional government. They credit her with creating a model of royal family life that emphasized domesticity and moral virtue, even if the reality was more complicated. They acknowledge that she worked hard throughout her reign and took her responsibilities seriously. They note that she supported many social reforms and showed concern for her subjects' welfare, even if her understanding was limited by her privileged position. At the same time, contemporary scholarship has been more willing to criticize Victoria's limitations. Historians point to her strong political biases and her frequent failures to maintain proper constitutional impartiality. They note her limited understanding of the lives of ordinary people and her resistance to democratic reforms. They examine her role in supporting and celebrating an empire that brought benefits to Britain, but often misery to colonized peoples. They recognize that much of Victoria's legacy was created by others, particularly by Albert, and by the ministers and advisors who actually made policy decisions. Victoria's personal character has also been reassessed. Earlier biographers tended to present her either as a saintly figure of duty and devotion, or as a difficult, demanding woman who happened to be queen. More recent scholarship has tried to see her as a complex human being shaped by her experiences and her historical context. Her difficult childhood created a woman who was both determined to assert her independence and deeply insecure. Her passionate nature made her capable of deep love, but also of intense jealousy and resentment. Her position at the center of British society gave her extraordinary privilege, but also isolated her from normal human contact. The Victorian age itself is now understood as a period of profound contradictions. It was an age of extraordinary progress in science, technology, and living standards for many people, but also an age of appalling poverty and exploitation. It was an age that produced great literature, art, and music, but also rigid social conventions and moral hypocrisy. It was an age that proclaimed the values of civilization and progress while building an empire through military force. Victoria herself embodied many of these contradictions: a powerful female monarch who opposed women's rights, a devoted mother who was often cold to her children, a symbol of moral propriety who formed controversial relationships with male servants. Victoria's influence on the British monarchy was perhaps her most enduring legacy. She established patterns that her successors would follow: the emphasis on family life and moral respectability, the careful separation between public duty and private life, the role of the monarch as a symbol of national unity above party politics. She showed that monarchy could survive and even thrive in an age of increasing democracy by adapting its role and maintaining its symbolic importance while accepting reduced political power. The modern British monarchy, with its emphasis on public service, charitable work, and family values, is fundamentally Victorian in character. Victoria's descendants spread across the royal houses of Europe, making her literally the grandmother of many 20th-century European monarchs. Through her carrier status for hemophilia, a genetic blood disorder, she also transmitted this disease to some of her descendants, including the Russian imperial family, with significant historical consequences. The network of relationships she created through dynastic marriages did not prevent the First World War, as she had hoped, but it did create complex family connections that influenced European politics for generations. In British popular culture and memory, Queen Victoria remains a powerful presence. She is remembered for giving her name to an entire age, for her long devotion to Albert's memory, for her famous phrase, "We are not amused," whether she actually said it or not. She appears in countless films, television series, books, and plays, often portrayed either as a stern, humorless figure in widow's weeds or as a passionate young woman experiencing romance and power. These popular images often tell us more about our own time than about Victoria herself, but they demonstrate her continuing hold on the public imagination. Historical assessment of Queen Victoria continues to evolve as new sources become available, and as historians ask new questions informed by changing concerns. Recent scholarship has examined Victoria's role in shaping ideas about gender and family, her relationship with empire and imperial subjects, and her influence on the development of constitutional monarchy. There is greater recognition of the ways in which Victoria was herself constrained by the conventions of her time and position, even as she exercised real power within those constraints. What remains clear is that Queen Victoria was one of the most significant monarchs in British history. She reigned through a period of transformation that saw Britain become the world's dominant industrial and imperial power. She gave her name to an age and shaped the institution of monarchy in ways that outlasted her by generations. She was a complex, flawed, fascinating individual who combined genuine dedication to duty with personal prejudices and limitations. She embodied both the achievements and the contradictions of the Victorian age. More than a century after her death, she remains a figure who fascinates historians and the public alike, a woman whose life touched millions and whose legacy continues to shape our understanding of monarchy, empire, and the Victorian world. Sources used: Victoria, A Life by A. N. Wilson, pages 525-562, Queen Victoria by Elizabeth Longford, pages 603–635. Victoria, R.I. by Christopher Hibbert, pages 449–479. Victoria. The Queen by Julia Baird, pages 548–612. The Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Victoria entry by H.C.G. Matthew and K.D. Reynolds. The Victorians by A.N. Wilson, pages 563–598. The Cambridge History of the British Empire, volume III, pages 612–647.